We're going to let that one speak for itself. Good morning and welcome to Morning Joe. It's Friday, May 7th. It's Friday. With us we have professor at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, MSNBC contributor Victoria DeFrancesco Soto, White House correspondent for Politico and co-author of The Playbook, Eugene Daniels. He's also an MSNBC contributor, and former aide to the George W. Bush White House and State Department's Elise Jordan is with us, along with Willie and me. And Joe has the morning off this morning, but we got this. Let's start this Friday morning with some positive news, okay, in the fight against the coronavirus. Here in the U.S., COVID-19 infections are now at their lowest levels in 7 months. The U.S. averaged about 48,000 new cases per day over the past week. That's a 13% improvement over the week before, and it's the first time since October that average daily cases have dipped below 50,000. According to Axios, over half of all American adults have now received at least one shot of a vaccine, and 41% of adults are fully vaccinated. Deaths and serious illnesses related to the coronavirus have dropped significantly. Well, this is hopeful, especially for our young people, Willie, who need to get back into society.
No question about it. And speaking of those young people, Mika, Moderna released new data yesterday showing its coronavirus vaccine is 96% effective in children ages 12 to 17. The vaccine trial for teenagers involved more than 3,200 participants. Just 12 cases of coronavirus were recorded during the 2 weeks after teens got their first dose. Moderna says it so far has not identified any serious safety concerns. We'll keep an eye on that. Meanwhile, two new studies show the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine is highly effective against virus variants. Researchers used real-world data from over 4,000 people vaccinated in Qatar and Israel at a time when the UK and South African variants were circulating in those areas. Both studies suggest the vaccine is effective against both strains and highly effective at preventing serious illness from the virus, Mika.
All right, this is good news. We'll follow it. We still have to watch what's happening around the world with the coronavirus, but at least some good news on the forefront right here. In politics this morning, there are several developments when it comes to Republican-led states altering election laws. In other words, solutions in search of a problem, as they chase Donald Trump's big lie that the 2020 vote was stolen from him. In a moment, we're going to tell you about what's going on in Texas, but first to Florida, where Governor Ron DeSantis signed into law new voting restrictions yesterday. The Associated Press called it a, quote, misleading, made-for-TV ceremony intended for the Republican Party's far right. DeSantis held the signing ceremony, live on Fox News, and Fox News only. And as you can see, he positioned himself for the cameras so he could make a presentation to the Fox audience. All other news organizations, including local press, were not allowed in. A columnist at the Sun-Sentinel tweeted, news media barred from entry at signing of controversial elections bill. DeSantis spokeswoman says the bill signing is a Fox exclusive. A reporter for the local CBS affiliate tweeted, the signing of a law that will affect all Floridians, and there won't be a camera from a Florida TV station allowed inside. This is not normal. A spokeswoman for DeSantis later said the governor did not sign the actual bill on camera. Oh, this is fantastic. And the event was purely ceremonial, so it was a fake bill. Here's how the governor explained it.
We were happy to give them the exclusive on that, and I think it went really, really well. But that's broadcast to millions of people, not just in obviously throughout the whole country, but a huge number of people in Florida are watching that. We had a crowd. We probably had 1,000 people in the crowd that were really cheering on.
Who does he sound like? And it's just crazy. So he signs a fake version of a bill. The crowd DeSantis just referred to was actually a group from Donald Trump's fan club. They were already in place at a West Palm Beach hotel, and DeSantis addressed the group before the live event on Fox. Fox News released a statement saying the show did not request or mandate that the signing be exclusive. But Willie, this is the bigger issue here is not the game being played with Fox here and Fox being used in whatever way it's being used, but the laws that he's signing. I mean, all of this is, when you look at what's going on in Florida, not necessary in Florida, but really, like, to really continue to reinforce and validate Donald Trump and his big lie. And the bigger conversation is that Trump has not gone away and he's planting roots.
Well, this law and others like it in Georgia and Texas and across the country are built on the foundation of that lie, that the 2020 election was not safe and secure, despite everything we know about it. And despite, by the way, what Governor DeSantis said back in February, he was touting the election process in Florida as having been safe and secure. Let's talk about the details of the new law. It adds some new hurdles to voting by mail. It limits who can collect and drop off ballots and makes it more difficult to provide water for voters waiting in line. The big question, why was it needed? In 2014, 2016, and 2018, Republicans outnumbered Democrats in the mail-in vote. But in 2020, Democrats dominated there as more voters requested mail-in ballots during the pandemic. Governor DeSantis claims the law will restore confidence in the state's elections, yet Donald Trump won Florida, and there have been no legitimate allegations or evidence of widespread voter fraud. The AP has called Florida a model for what voting should look like in America. Governor DeSantis himself, as I said, has praised how well the state manages its elections.
The way Florida did it, I think, inspires confidence. I think that's how elections should be run, rather than us be at the center of a Bush versus Gore in 2020. We're now being looked at as the state that did it right and the state that these other states should emulate. The result of 2020, from an administrative perspective, was that Florida had the most transparent and efficient election anywhere in the country.
That is Governor DeSantis himself just in February, a couple of months ago. As the New York Times notes, the state now has weakened key parts of the voting infrastructure built after that 2000 election fiasco. Let's bring in national political reporter for Politico, someone who knows Florida politics as well as anybody, Mark Caputo. Mark, good morning. It's good to see you. So, first of all, the spectacle yesterday of the Fox News exclusive, Governor DeSantis obviously broadcasting to a national audience about a state law, and also the particulars of what this bill does. What did you make of what you saw yesterday?
I made of it like kind of DeSantis goes home. Understand that DeSantis kind of exploded out of nowhere on the statewide political scene in 2018. And the reason he was able to win the Republican primary, outside of getting Trump's endorsement, was his constant appearances on Fox. In fact, that's what helped him get the endorsement from Trump in the first place. Trump was always able to see him on his favorite network. We calculated at one point that the amount of money in kind of free TV time that he got on Fox is what kept him competitive with his better known at the time Republican rival, who was a statewide elected official, Adam Putnam. So DeSantis and Fox kind of go hand in glove, chocolate and peanut butter. So in this regard, it's probably no surprise. Also, DeSantis increasingly, amid the pandemic, reverted back to being much more of a reactionary, right-wing conservative politician. There was a lot of negative, and I think in many respects, bad national media coverage of Florida regarding his response to COVID. He didn't get that in conservative media, and so his instincts not to trust mainstream news media were just reinforced. So in that regard as well, as I said, he's sort of kind of coming home. Here, it just looks like this, from what we understand, was just sort of a spur-of-the-moment decision by DeSantis. He was going to do this Fox show anyway. He wanted to be able to kind of bring something to the table, and he's got his eyes on 2024. We're right now in the kind of the really early super-duper primary, the shadow primary that's going on in the Republican Party. DeSantis is a front runner, if not the front runner, for taking Donald Trump's mantle in 2024, assuming that Donald Trump doesn't run. You combine all of these factors together, and this doesn't come as much of a surprise. One of the animating principles in the Republican Party right now is the hatred of the mainstream news media. So the more criticism Ron DeSantis can get for things like signing an elections restriction bill, the better it is for him as he eyes both his re-election in 2022 and a possible bid for president in 2024.
So, Mark, let's put the spectacle to the side and talk about the substance of the law that was passed in the state of Florida. We just heard directly from the mouth of Governor DeSantis his own praise for the election process in November, again in February, how well it was run in Florida, how few problems there actually were. So what does this new law do, and why was he compelled to pass it?
The law actually, I guess I'm going to say something that's going to get me in trouble in that it's not as bad as the critics say it is. Yet it was premised on a lie. That is, there was not widespread systemic voter fraud, either in Florida or nationwide, or in swing states, that cost Donald Trump the election. And this was a reaction to that. And as you pointed out, Ron DeSantis had talked about, hey, we did it right in Florida. We're a model. The problem is the former president got the base so stirred up that these politicians had to react. So they made some changes around the edges. They made the request for absentee ballots used to be on a standing list. You could get them for 2 general elections in a row. Now you can just get them for 1 general election in the midterm. There are more restrictions on, what some people call ballot harvesting, which is when other people can drop off your ballot. Now, I'm in Miami-Dade County. Incidentally, we're the biggest county in the state. We already have some of those restrictions in place anyway. And in the end, what you have here was a solution in search of a problem. And, I can say that I'm glad I do live in Florida as far as voting, because we have 30 days of voting by mail still. Most states don't have that. We have 8 days of in-person early voting before Election Day as a minimum. And here in Miami-Dade County, we've got 14 days of that. And then you got Election Day voting. So those abilities to cast ballots were not restricted. But these kind of smaller, minor changes that were made, things that do make it a little tougher for some folks to register to vote or some folks to cast their absentee ballots were made. There were also changes made in drop boxes as well. Those were done largely to just kind of placate the base to say, you wanted us to do something, now we've done something.
Politico's Mark Caputo, I think you put it all into context perfectly, and we want to take that and move across the country and then pull out and look at it all. Just hours after Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed that new voting restriction laws, Texas emerged as the next state to push forward with one of its own. The Republican majority in the Texas state legislature moved to debate a controversial voting bill that they say will protect from election fraud. Democrats have vowed to file more than 100 amendments aimed at either derailing the legislation or at least limiting its impact if it is passed. During yesterday's House debate, the House sponsor of the bill was unable to cite a single case of voter fraud in Texas. That's the key there. The Texas bill would, among a slew of other reforms, ban election officials from proactively mailing out absentee ballots or applications, empower partisan poll watchers and make it harder to remove them for bad behavior, and set strict new rules for assisting voters. Victoria DeFrancesco Soto, talk about how this move in Texas could impact voters or overall what you see happening here.
Well, Mika, we see a lot of similarities with Florida. So Governor Greg Abbott himself conceded that there were no voting irregularities in the 2020 election. So much like Governor DeSantis in Florida, we also heard from another election official here in Texas that said that the 2020 election was smooth and secure. So the head scratcher is, so then why do we see these voting enhancement or these voting security bills as a top priority for the state? And as you pointed out, yesterday, the author of the bill was asked point blank, why do we need these bills if nothing was broken? And the answer, he was fumbling and mumbling along. He's like, well, we don't have to wait for something bad to happen in order to do this. But the issue is that what you're doing in passing these bills is curtailing people's democratic right to vote. Here in Texas, it's like anywhere else, it's a numbers game. And the Democrats are in the minority, and they simply don't have the votes to block this bill. But what we saw yesterday afternoon through the wee hours of the morning was the Texas delegation fighting hard to lessen the harm of the bill. And we're still waiting for the final vote, for it to go to conference committee, but it looks like the Democratic delegation was able to tamp down on some of the most stringent criminalization provisions for simple errors in registering and in election officials doing that. Also, making it less easy for partisan poll watchers. It seems like they were able to slim that down as well. But the thing that does remain, and that really hurts Texans, especially Texans of color, is the ability to send out mail ballot requests. We saw that Harris County, where Houston's located, did that. 2.5 million voters were able to very easily request mail-in ballots. That is definitely not on the table. That is going to be taken away. So we see all of these cuts, right? Death by 1,000 cuts to our voting rights here in Texas, and just really troublesome and worrisome, Mika.
I want to bring up Elise Jordan on why this matters. These laws based on the notion that there was widespread voter fraud. These laws based on lies. These laws validating the big lie that the 2020 election was stolen. It's growing the belief, by the way, that January 6th didn't matter either. It is going on Fox, Governor Ron DeSantis with a stunt, signing a fake bill that, isn't the real bill, but he signed it somewhere else, but doing a stunt on live TV to Fox viewers, lapping it all up, millions of people, again, all based on a lie and a stunt to grow that belief that the election was stolen. It points to two things. First of all, to the really pathetic nature of these politicians' ability to lead and go with their gut and put country over party. That's number one. But number two, let's just admit it. Trump is clawing his way back. He is so angry that he won fairly that he's going to do whatever he can to try and feed that lie, using whatever power or whatever authority he has over these pathetic Republicans who have no spines, who are so scared of him, even though they could be done with them. They could be free of him, and they could put him behind them if they would just say and do the right thing. Instead, they're propping up Elise Stefanik and, forcing her to move away from her own core values that she expressed publicly years ago when Trump was first running. She expressed very strong statements about his statements toward women, the way he treated other countries that he didn't think were up to par. Elise Stefanik talked about how the president did not represent America's core values, and now she's being used as a mouthpiece to this terrible message that Kevin McCarthy wants carried by someone who's capable of carrying it. Trust me, it's not Liz Cheney, because she will not lie to the American people, and she will not prop up a cult leader and his unbelievable lie that could destabilize this country for administrations to come. If you heard Bob Gates on our show yesterday, you'd be very worried about the years to come and Trump's impact on our democracy. So, Elise, I mean, first of all, how many ways can we count how many times Trump has thrown people away and yet these idiots follow him? I guess my question to you is there a direct connection between what's happening in Florida and Texas and what went down in Georgia with these voting laws that could further destabilize our country on the foreign stage?
Mika, it's petrifying, and you look at how these politicians are so shameless, and they just really have no sense of decency, and they're willing to use their offices to promote a lie. And I like that Mark Caputo pointed out that the election law in Florida is a lot of theater, because that's what this is. 9/11 happened, hugely traumatic. So many people died on American soil. We're stuck with security theater at our airports for the rest of our lives. Now with this, how are our elections going to fundamentally change? Because Donald Trump is a self-inflicted trauma with this imaginary crisis. And so we have state politicians clamoring to placate dear leader who is out of office at his political grave in Mar-a-Lago with this election theater nonsense playing on Fox News in the Fox News early 2021 primary. That's all it is. And so I think of America's grand tradition of standing for democracy in the world and how that was so important to our core values, to the post-World War II order. And now you look at this election nonsense where politicians are clamoring to have fewer Americans vote easily just because of Donald Trump and just because Donald Trump still will not concede that he lost an election. And it's incredibly
Eugene
scary.
Daniels. It is. Eugene Daniels, you listen to Mark Caputo give a clear-eyed assessment of that law and saying it changes some things around the margin. But the point of all this is to nod to Donald Trump's lie, because that's what the party has to do. If you listen to Congresswoman Elise Stefanik talking on the radio yesterday, doing interviews to shore up her support among Donald Trump's supporters by reinforcing the idea that there was something wrong with the 2020 election, that we have to secure our elections. This is all, again, built on that foundation of the lie perpetuated by Donald Trump. But state by state by state and in Congress up on Capitol Hill, nearly every member, every Republican member, every elected official feels that they have to, for their own political future, nod to Donald Trump.
Oh, absolutely, right? We don't even really hear from Donald Trump as much as we used to, obviously, when he was president. You know, Facebook is keeping him off. He's not on Twitter. He's not doing as many interviews. We're getting those kind of statements, I guess, that seem written like as if they were on Twitter. And so what's happening is all of these Republicans, even if they're not hearing directly from him, they are guesstimating what Donald Trump would do or say in that situation to them, depending on what they would do. And that part of it is, you know, that's a really interesting way to run a party. You know, you have a Republican Party who the question isn't, you know, is our leader Donald Trump? That isn't the question. The question is, do they have a party that operates at the whim of someone named Donald Trump? And I think that's where the Republican Party is. And that's where they've been for a really long time. And there was this period after January 6th, we all remember it, where even Republicans were like, you know what, maybe Trumpism and Donald Trump aren't what we want in our party. And they were explicit about that. McCarthy was explicit about that. McConnell was explicit about that. And we've seen, and it's been kind of shocking as quickly, you know, over the last 100 or so days, how quickly the Republican Party has just kind of returned back to Trumpism as the main force of that party. And that's something that we're seeing with Liz Cheney, possibly being ousted, with Elise Stefanik and her star rising, because simply what she's doing is just parroting Donald Trump and thinking about the things that he would want to say. And this isn't really a party that is concentrating on policy too much, right? We've talked about that on this show, and everyone's been reporting on that, talking about Mr. and Mrs. Potato Head, talking about Dr. Seuss, talking about trans kids. It's not a party, you know, are you conservative enough? Or even when Donald Trump was in office, did you support him enough? Because if that was the case, Liz Cheney would not be being attacked, because according to 538, who focused on and kept track of congressional voting of members in Congress, 92.9% of the time, Liz Cheney voted with Donald Trump. Elise Stefanik, 77.7%. So this is all tied up in that big lie that you guys have been talking about. And Caputo is right, and I say that because he's my colleague, but also because it's true. In all of this, this is tied up in, and no matter what Republicans do, no matter what law they push for this year or next year, if they use the words election integrity, their election restrictions, all of that is tied up into the same thing. And so they try to say that this is a more nuanced conversation, but it doesn't matter. Like Mika said, this is a solution looking for a problem. And that's something that's really concerning voting rights advocates, and they're pushing for Democrats to fix something that Republicans are kind of breaking here with H.R. 1 and H.R. 4, which is a voting rights act, and that would put in key provisions back into the Voting Rights Act that were taken out by the Supreme Court. And that's something that, you know, at this point, it's hard to see it get through the Senate get passed and get to Joe Biden's desk. But that is where people are putting a lot of their time and efforts in, is hoping that Democrats at some point are able to shore up the federal aspect of this, because states are moving forward with these, these voter restrictive laws.
So coming up, we're going to run through the evolution of Congresswoman Elise Stefanik. She praised President Trump as the voice of the Republican Party.
Voters are speaking loudly and clearly. President Trump is the leader and the voice of the Republican Party. The job of the conference chair is to represent the majority of the House Republicans. The vast majority of the House Republicans support President Trump, and they also support his focus on election integrity and election security. The job of the conference chair is not to attack fellow members of the conference and attack President Trump. It's to unify so that our voters know that they can count on us to deliver results and win back the majority and take the gavel.
Voting with Trump. Stefanik only did so 77.7% of the time. What more do you need? Willie?
The editors of the National Review say in a new editorial, Liz Cheney is not the problem. They write this, quote, "At the end of the day, the problem isn't that Cheney is making controversial statements. The problem is that Republicans consider her obviously true statements to be controversial. It isn't Cheney who is preventing Republicans from moving on and repairing the wounds from the 2020 election. It is Trump himself. 6 months after being defeated, he still won't drop it in statements, in TV appearances, and in impromptu speeches to small crowds at Mar-a-Lago. These statements are divisive and false, yet the same people now coming after Cheney don't raise a peep about them. Indeed, Cheney is being accused of distracting from the fight against Biden when some Trump supporters have displayed more passion about taking her out than opposing Biden's $6 trillion agenda. If Cheney's enemies think we should be talking about Biden and not Trump, they've certainly picked a funny way to show it." That is from the National Review, of course, a conservative publication. Elise Jordan, when you look at Elise Stefanik, her story is kind of a parable of the Trump era for Republicans. I would call her an Elise Jordan Republican. She worked in the Bush White House. She worked on the presidential campaign for Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan. She worked for Tim Pawlenty for a while, a moderate Republican. And then a switch was flipped, and she realized, like so many Republicans, that the way to keep power and to elevate your own position is to hug Donald Trump as closely as possible.
Well, it's been sad for me to watch the evolution of Elise Stefanik. You know, she was in the Bush White House at the same time. She had a really great reputation as being super sharp, hardworking in the Chief of Staff's office. I've watched her career with interest and her rise, and it has been just striking how quickly she turned the switch and was willing to just go for craven political power and ignore what she had previously espoused as her principles. And it's just sad to see someone like Elise Stefanik, who you know is a very smart woman, going and bowing at the altar of Seb Gorka and Steve Bannon, and with this election nonsense. She's better than that, I want to believe, but she's not showing us that at all right now, and it's really disappointing.
Well, we're going to come back to this. There's a lot more to talk about, but we want to turn now to the latest on the debate over police reform. Republican Senator Tim Scott says a bipartisan deal is closer than ever. One major point of focus is a compromise on qualified immunity. That is the legal protection given to officers that make it difficult for people to sue them. Democrats have long targeted it as a key change required in police reform. But our next guest says that isn't the answer to fixing policing in America. Joining us now, former member of President Obama's task force on 21st century policing, Cedric Alexander. He's the former public safety director of DeKalb County in Georgia, now an MSNBC law enforcement analyst. His latest opinion piece for the Washington Post is entitled, "Why Reforming Qualified Immunity Will Never Resolve Police Violence." Thank you for coming back on the show. I guess I'll add to that question that is your headline and say, why couldn't it be a part of reforming it?
Well, it can't be the reform in and of itself, Mika, and here's why. Even though there's compelling arguments on both sides of the aisle around qualified immunity. Certainly, the left make a tremendous and compelling argument, but so does the right. And someone like myself, who's been a former chief of police, who's been a police officer, certainly do understand it from both sides of the aisle. But here's what's going to make a difference: not qualified immunity in and of itself. All that allows for us to communities and cities get into these civil litigations around police misconduct that is costing them millions and billions of dollars across this country every year. What's going to make the difference, quite frankly? We got to go back and we have to look at how we're going to reform police. And we have to acknowledge the fact that police in and of itself cannot be the only source of public safety. We need to find exactly what it is that we want our police officers to do. We need to narrow that scope, as I indicated in the article, and we need to train them to that measure. And then we need to train others who are more capable and more better trained and equipped to enter into communities that are suffering with a great deal of homelessness, mental illness, etc. Those social issues in which we've called on police to do, in which they're not able to do, that creates this dynamic and puts them in a position of taking action is something they're not trained to do. And then we get into this whole area of civil discourse. So I think it's important for us to recognize as well, Mika, that we need to look at who we're hiring to be police officers today. We got to hire the best and the brightest, but that also have to mean they must be well trained, they have to be well educated, and they have to have the ability to have great critical thinking as part of the process and the work that they do every day in a very complex and a very diverse community across this country. So we have to train them. We have to make sure we have supervision in place that holds them responsible. And you have a healthy police department that is going to make sure that the values of that officer and of that department lines up with that of that community. That's how you reduce the likelihood of civil cases that we see so much of. Not just saying qualified immunity in and of itself is going to fix this. It's not. There's great arguments on both sides, but in order to fix this, what I am presenting in this article is some solutions to think about from a national level. If they want to do some reform, think about reforms of how you can be impactful, Congress, on both sides of the aisle. That's going to be long-term, and it's going to be significant to the benefit of communities across this country. That is just not going to resolve in let's get rid of qualified immunity. No, let's look at how we reform policing for the betterment of the community.
Cedric, it's Willie Geist. Great to have you on this morning. You've been in law enforcement for 40 years, I think, as an officer and a chief, and held a number of positions, so we respect your opinion on this. The debate inside qualified immunity right now in Congress seems to be that Republicans don't want a specific officer to be able to be sued, to be held accountable. The compromise seems to be that, well, we could sue the police department itself, and that gets into some of the questions you raise in your piece, which is this, frankly, is just a budgetary question for municipalities. They can't afford to be sued again and again. Do you see any compromise in there where it could be on the police department, that it could be on the city and not on the individual officer?
Well, I think that's going to require a whole lot of conversation, really, but I think the problem is here, the jumping off point, the conversations they're trying to have. They're stuck on this whole qualified immunity. Let's get rid of it altogether. Here again, there are great arguments on both sides. I, as a police officer, want to be able to go out and do my job, really, if I'm responding to come to your home or wherever. And I may have to make a decision in a split second, and I can't be concerned about whether I'm going to be personally sued or not. The cases in which I am referring to, we need to take note to, are the cases that are truly egregious. Cases that we see occur very often across this country, where we see horrible police behavior. Those are the cases in which we need to consider whether those officers need to be personally be held responsible. But when it comes back to let's not sue the city, let's sue the police department, I don't understand that one, because police departments get their budget from the cities. So you're still suing the city. But I think there's room for conversation. But I think what they really need to look at, Willie, is the fact that in this country, if we're going to reform policing the ways in which I'm suggesting and others are suggesting, then we're going to see a reduction in these civil cases, and you're going to be able to see these cases to be more resolved. But in these cases where we're seeing officers that are just being totally egregious of police misconduct in this country, we somehow got to make sure that cities and police departments are not held responsible for those types of egregious actions that is costing communities millions of dollars in which they cannot afford.
Cedric Alexander, thank you very much for coming back on the show. We will see you soon for sure. And coming up, our next guest